I nodded to Brutal that he should get on with the rehearsal. He took the mask from the brass hook on the back of the chair and rolled it down over Toot Toot's head, pulling it snug under his chin, which opened the hole at the top to its widest diameter. Then Brutal leaned over, picked the wet circle of sponge out of the bucket, pressed one finger against it, then licked the tip of the finger. That done, he put the sponge back in the bucket. Tomorrow he wouldn't. Tomorrow he would tuck it into the cap perched on the back of the chair. Not today, though. There was no need to get Toot's old head wet. The cap was steel, and with the straps dangling down on either side, it looked sort of like a doughboy's helmet. Brutal put it on old Toot Toot's head, snugging it down over the hole in the black head covering. Get in the cap. Get in the cap. Get in the cap, Toot said, and now his voice sounded squeezed as well as muffled. The straps held his jaw almost closed, and I suspected Brutal had snugged it down a little tighter than he strictly had to for purposes of rehearsal. He stepped back, faced the empty seats, and said, "Arlen Bitterbuck, electricity shall now be passed through your body until you are dead, in accordance with state law." May God have mercy on your soul. Brutal turned to the mesh-covered rectangle. Roll on to. Old Toot, perhaps trying to recapture his earlier flair of comic genius, began to buck and flail in the chair, as old Sparky's actual customers almost never did. "Now I'm fryin'," he cried. "Fryin'. Fryin'. Gee, I'm a done Tom Turkey." Harry and Dean, I saw, were not watching this at all. They had turned away from Sparky and were looking across the empty storage room at the door leading back into my office. "Well, I'll be goddamned," Harry said. "One of the witnesses came a day early." Sitting in the doorway with its tail curled neatly around its paws, watching with its beady black oil spot eyes, was the mouse. "5. The execution went well, if there was ever such a thing as a good one, a proposition I strongly doubt. Then the execution of Arlen Bitterbuck, council elder of the Washita Cherokee, was it?" He got his braids wrong, his hands were shaking too badly to make a good job of it, and his eldest daughter, a woman of 30-odd, was allowed to plait them nice and even. She wanted to weave feathers in at the tips, the pin feathers of a hawk, his bird, but I couldn't allow it. They might catch fire and burn. I didn't tell her that, of course, just said it was against regulations. She made no protest, only bowed her head and put her hands to her temples to show her disappointment and her disapproval. She conducted herself with great dignity, that woman, and by doing so practically guaranteed that her father would do the same. The chief left his cell with no protest or holding back when the time came. Sometimes we had to pry their fingers off the bars. I broke one or two in my time and have never forgotten the muffled snapping sound. But the chief wasn't one of those, thank God. He walked strong up the Green Mile to my office, and there he dropped to his knees to pray with Brother Schuster, who had driven down from the Heavenly Light Baptist Church in his flivver. Schuster gave the chief a few psalms, and the chief started to cry when Schuster got to the one about lying down beside the still waters. It wasn't bad, though, no hysteria, nothing like that. I had an idea he was thinking about still water so pure and so cold it felt like it was cutting your mouth every time you drank some. Actually, I like to see them cry a little. It's when they don't that I get worried. A lot of men can't get up from their knees again without help, but the chief did okay in that department. He swayed a little at first, like he was lightheaded, and Dean put out a hand to steady him, but Bitterbuck had already found his balance again on his own, so out we went. Almost all the chairs were occupied, with the people in them murmuring quietly among themselves, like folks do when they're waiting for a wedding or a funeral to get started. That was the only time Bitterbuck faltered. I don't know if it was any one person in particular that bothered him, or all of them together, but I could hear a low moaning start up in his throat, and all at once the arm I was holding had a drag in it that hadn't been there before. Out of the corner of my eye I could see Harry Terwilliger moving up to cut off the chief's retreat if Bitterbuck all at once decided he wanted to go hard. I tightened my grip on his elbow and tapped the inside of his arm with one finger. "Steady, Chief," I said out of the corner of my mouth, not moving my lips. The only thing most of these people will remember about you is how you go out, so give them something good, show them how a Washita does it. He glanced at me sideways and gave a little nod. Then he took one of the braids his daughter had made and kissed it. I looked to Brutal, standing at parade rest behind the chair, resplendent in his best blue uniform, all the buttons on the tunic polished and gleaming, his hat sitting square John perfect on his big head. I gave him a little nod and he shot it right back, stepping forward to help Bitterbuck mount the platform if he needed help. Turned out he didn't. It was less than a minute from the time Bitterbuck sat down in the chair to the moment when Brutal called roll on 2. Softly back over his shoulder. The lights dimmed down again, but only a little. You wouldn't have noticed it if you hadn't been looking for it. That meant Van Hay had pulled the switch some wit had labeled Mabel's hair dryer. There was a low humming from the cap, and Bitterbuck surged forward against the clamps and the restraining belt across his chest. Over against the wall, the prison doctor watched expressionlessly, lips thinned until his mouth looked like a single white stitch.